Okay, so this is where we left off. All right, so between watching the video and working through practice problems 3, 5, and 11 using the help tools if you needed them, you should have a pretty good understanding of how to determine classes, frequencies, midpoints, relative frequencies, and cumulative frequencies. So now what we're going to do is we're going to start talking about ways to graph the information in the frequency distribution. All right, and the first, probably most common way to do that is to use a histogram. All right, so the first thing to note here, the format, what the histogram is going to look like. It is always going to be a bar chart, all right, which is what you're seeing in these two examples. Other things to note about when the histogram is constructed, one is how the classes are labeled. So the classes in your frequency distribution, they are always going to be labeled on the horizontal axis. All right, so this is where you're referencing your data values according to the histogram, right, what you see in those classes. However, you'll notice each class is only represented by one number, not a lower and an upper limit. And that's because in the histogram, each class is labeled only by its midpoint. All right, now from there, you're going to make sure when you construct your graph, you set a scale for what you're graphing. Now, technically, histograms can be done using raw frequencies, the counts, or relative frequencies. So the key thing to note here is you always want to make sure you set a scale that you're going to graph by. This one's going by 2s, 2, 4, 6, 8, 10. This one is relative frequencies, right, decimals, and so it's using a scale of 0.1, 0.1, 0.2, 0.3, 0.4. You can decide what that scale needs to be. If your numbers are big, you might go 10, 20, 30, 40. But you have to define that to get an accurate graph. And then lastly, you're going to come in here, and for each class, you're going to draw a bar centered over the midpoint where the height of the bar specifies the frequency of that class, right? Or if you're using relative frequencies, because remember I said you can do this either way, the height of the bar would specify the relative frequency. And notice this is coming from looking at where that bar is according to the scale that you set on your vertical axis. So like the one I'm looking at here with frequencies is a 9. Right there between 8 and 10. The one over here with relative frequencies looks like it's about maybe 0.36, 0.37. But again, I'm basing it on the scale, which is why that scale is so important. All right, so let's say that we want to construct a histogram, and we're going to do this just based on frequencies. It'll always specify. All right, so we're not going to do relative, we're going to do raw frequencies. And we want to do this for the speeds that we've been working with. So notice here, over here on the right-hand side, I went ahead and pulled what I needed. If I'm doing a frequency histogram, all right, then what I need, and I'm going to pull this right from what we did, what I need are the midpoints of each class, right? Those are right here. And the frequency, right, which are my values right here. All right, if I hadn't found them already, then I'd have to do this at this point. All right, but I've already found them, I've already got them, so I just pulled those values over here because that's what I'm going to graph. Now, when I go to set up my graph on my horizontal axis, I'm going to label my midpoint. So you'll notice I'm going to do a little broken axis symbol here. That just means I'm not starting from 0. And I'm going to start with my first midpoint of 38. And then I'm going to evenly space these midpoints, right, because all the classes should be the same size, across the horizontal axis. You'll also notice I'm always going to label whatever numbers I'm putting on my graph. All right, so these values represent speeds in our data set, and their units are in miles per hour. Now I'm going to come over here to my vertical axis and I'm going to label a scale for my frequencies. My frequencies only go up to 12 here. So it's not like I need a huge scale, right? Like 10, 20, 30. So kind of like the example we just saw, all right, I'm going to go by 2s, making sure that I at least clear that maximum frequency of 12 on my scale. And I'm going to label, always label the numbers you're putting on here, that these are frequencies. All right, and then now all I'm going to do is draw a bar where the height of each bar will specify the frequency. Big thing to remember is center the bar on the midpoint. It's not the beginning of it, it's the middle of it. So for 38, I'm going to center the bar, I'm starting just below 38. I'm going to go up to my frequency of 12. I'm going to draw my bar there, and then I'm going to bring this down on the other side. Now, I've got a nice little trick on my iPad here to make my line straight. Use a straight edge. All right. I will ask you to graph these things on paper for your test, not just pick the value in my stat lab. So make sure you get in the habit of drawing these using a straight edge. The other big thing to remember about the histogram, there shouldn't be no spaces between your bars. So when you go to do this for the second class, right, you want to center it over 45. Don't start back down at the bottom. Continue it from the first bar. So I'm going to pull out from the first bar right here at 11. So between the 10 and the 12. And then I'm going to pull this down on the other side so that there are no spaces between the bars. All right, it should make kind of one solid shape. And so I'm going to come down here and do the same for 52. It has a frequency of 4. Pulling that out from the previous class. And then the last 3 classes here, they're going to have the same frequency estimated down here at 1. A little bit longer. Now keep in mind when you're doing this, your classes should all have the same width, so your bars should all be roughly the same width. Now when you're doing this by hand on paper, they're not perfect, so all mine probably aren't exactly the same, but you mainly want to make sure that you don't have some bars that look like this, and then a bar that looks like this, and then another skinny one, right? They should reflect as closely as you can classes that have the same width. All right, and that's all there is to it. Okay, so at this point, I want you to go back to that number 11. Right, I had you walk through those 3, and I said when you got to number 11, just do the first part. Well, now that you've done that, I want you to go back and see if you can construct the histogram. And make sure you draw the histogram on paper. Don't just try to guess the right answer based on the multiple choice in my stat lab, because when it comes test time, I will require that you graph these things on paper so that I can see that you know to use midpoints, that you know to set your scale, that you know not to include spaces. So when I say go back and finish problem number 11, what I mean is for whatever distribution you did in this first part, construct a histogram on paper, then come in here to my stat lab and pick the graph that most closely resembles the one that you constructed on your paper. All right, and after you've done that, all right, after you've practiced with your histogram a little bit, then I have one more video in here that will help you to see how the polygon and the ogive are going to be constructed as different formats for graphing the frequency distribution.